Welcome everybody to the IFOW 2022 at JOO 2022 here in Jönköping, Sweden. And I'm going to just turn it right over to Robert to talk about for the next hour about ABV. Over to you.
All right. Good afternoon. So this is our fermentation workshop on alcohol by volume. I will be the chair of the discussion. Just quickly, so our agenda is to quickly go over the ABV stakeholders because it is a number, but it is a number that's important to many different factions within the modeling community. And we've talked about this on and off in various different formats. So I will go over to some of the points of discussion we've had so far. I will make a few comments that will rile a few people up just to start off the conversation. I will share this discussion one by assigning speaking turns, just because it becomes impossible otherwise on a video conference to have a proper conversation. We are supposed to run for 1 hour, and we will keep to that in order to give the beer styles as much time as possible. And if you keep talking, the vaudeville hook will appear and we will cut you off. So previously, we talked about ABV from a couple of different perspectives. And there's the production of alcohol and how we sample that ABV at different places within that production. There's a packaging angle in that there is a tremendous amount of commercial interest in the ABV because it is required to be labeled on the packaging in most jurisdiction. It is also the amount by which the ABV determines the taxation rate within the jurisdiction. And finally, it's a part of the nutritional and the alcohol intake calculations for most diet analysis. And this occurs in wine, beer, spirits, and oddly enough, it also occurs in some specific foods that are not considered alcoholic products, such as, say, vanilla extracts. However, in order to be called vanilla extracts within certain jurisdictions, they need a certain ABV volume. So there's an inherent contradiction there in that it's alcohol in one case, and in the other case, it's termed not to be alcohol, even though it has the same measurements as alcohol. So we can look at this from a process measurement perspective where we follow it around within a production process. We can determine it to be an objective of the process. We can talk about it as a nominal amount of the product within a package, or we can talk about the actual amount measured for that specific package. And all of these, while generically everyone can point at a beer of glass on a table and everybody will say, yes, that's beer, the definition of beer and the specific aspects of, say, alcoholic beverages in multiple jurisdiction vary slightly. So there is an opportunity here to actually start towards some kind of hierarchy where we say this is the thing, and this is the thing within different jurisdiction and how it changes. So we have multiple communities in this room, and I think it's important that we have this discussion in order to have a proper conversation. So quickly, my comments about this work so far. We look at ontologies as these information systems that must be coherent, that must be consistent, and that are generally seen to be these ideal, perfect knowledge repository. But in fact, the real world is messy. People call one thing a beer when it's not a beer, and then there's root beer, which can be alcoholic but not always. And there's a number of corner cases where we get stuck in that we're not getting what the ontology says we should be getting, even though everybody will look at it and say, yes, that makes it perfect sense. Similarly, we as a community tend to like these very detailed, complex solutions that are extremely elegant. But at the end of the day, most programmers just want one property in one place that solves the problem, even though it doesn't handle most of the corner cases that they should be worried about. And there is mention that's spoken about this in other areas, especially with respect to journalism. But the W3C has similarly noted the same problems with the semantic web. And my own soapbox is that I think we overload the subclassing without necessarily looking at what typing can also give us, even if it makes that ontological solution a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to open up the floor to comments. If you'd like to have a turn at speaking, please raise your hand.
One other thing, I'm just going to interject. I plan to do a bit of diagramming through this session, just to sort of paint the process modeling a bit forward. And so I'm going to put in a link to our existing wine ontology, which has a bit of fermentation. I'll probably rename that just to fermentation. So it's a draw IO diagram you might be able to access online as we work on it with its different tabs of fermentation things. So back to you, Warren, on that.
Excellent. So Trey Rumping is the first person to comment. So I'm going to turn the mic over to him as our first sacrificial victim.
Thanks, Robert. I don't actually have, just wanted to give you a quick compliment on starting by grounding this discussion in stakeholders and sort of end use of all this. That's all. Thumbs up. Let's keep going.
Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate that. Matthew, please go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I really like the stakeholder perspective. We use it a lot. I'm wondering, is your plan to talk about sort of trade-offs from different stakeholder perspectives, or what, I mean, with different worldviews, we can often create diagrams differently depending on where we're sitting and which part of the animal we're touching, so to speak.
Okay, from my perspective, the way that I saw this work as a means of getting different people to talk to each other and giving Damion a hard time keeping up with some of our ideas. But,
fair.
However, from my perspective, I'm sort of wedded to certain ideas that even though they are not ideal, that's how those markets function. So for example, ABV from my perspective is always the end product as marketed commercially. And I'm stuck with the schema.org and the GS1 vocabularies that have very specific, right now, point in time views of those numbers. And that's not workable with a process view, but that is what I'm dealing with right now for certain situations.
I'm wondering if we can start with just a general definition of an ABV term that you could subclass into places where that's measured, points in time or points in the process or points at the on the store distribution shelf.
So here. All right, I'm raising my own hand. There we go. One of my concerns with that, Damion, and I'm not sure if anybody else has an opinion on this. If we class ABV, the issue is, okay, we have this ABV class that's perfectly fine, and it has specific subclasses within areas. And now if I go into specific point in times commercial notation, such as, for example, GS1, that's actually a property. So you're getting AL full, which most people are not willing to deal with that amount of complexity within a view. So it's, does anyone have any comment on that particular perspective? Come on, guys, I'm starting to wonder if my internet connection just died.
I found it a little bit hard to actually hear part of your question, Robert, because the connection from our end was breaking down a little bit. If you could repose that again about the subclassing.
Well, okay. So if you look at this from a subclassing perspective and you have an ABV class, to go from if we look at it from points in time versus a property that is instantaneous, that means, at least in our land, you're going to have subclassing that goes from classes to property. And that means I'll full. And are people comfortable using that?
So there's going to be a process of measuring ABV, and then there's, if I'm not mistaken, ABV can be called a measurement. So we could start with a definition of ABV as a measurement, and then have another term called ABV process, or measurement process, and keep those as two separate classes with their each respective hierarchies. Is that addressing what the confusion you think might arise, Robert? And Warren, is that also kind of your practice?
Okay. From my perspective, I have individual terms just because it's currently ontologically complex to relate them. Jumping from a class to a property.
Okay. Oops, not that.
Okay,
Go ahead.
that's interesting. So I was just going to comment that in OWL DL, this is not OWL full yet. You can define a concept in terms of the existence of a data property within a certain interval. So you can just say I have a class of beverages which have an ABV of between 5 and 10%. This is something you can do in LDL already. Would this come close to what was being described previously with like the ABV as a property? As in you have a class of the things with this property between this range. Yeah, this is the definition you can do in LDL.
Yeah, I would throw in there that I'm not too concerned about being limited to particular OWL versions. If we can talk about these concepts and get some agreement about what's a data item, what's a measurement, and what's a process, and then sort out the technical details of what logic profile they end up in, I think we're making progress. So first, feedback on that, either Robert or Warren, and then I see Troy has a question.
Okay, I'm asking what people's experiences are. I've likewise not really worried about which OWL flavor I'm working with, and I know that this causes some people concern.
Okay, Troy?
Thanks. Thanks. I think if I'm following the debate correctly, the sort of two main options that Robert's putting on the table is thinking of ABV as an attribute of the product. So maybe sort of akin to the weight of it or the color of it or something like that, versus alcohol as a subcomponent of a compositional food, an ingredient, so to speak, or one of the chemicals, akin to barley as an analog. Am I following the debate correctly? Just to sort of make things simple, alcohol as ingredient versus alcohol as attribute of a finished product.
I would that would be an alternate definition of yes.
It seems to me that out of those two, alcohol as ingredient or component of something complex versus alcohol as attribute of a product, akin to its weight, I would think that the former, as component, is both more usable and more, I don't know, true to the, or creates more flexibility for us in general, without necessarily creating a lot of complexity.
But
That would be my reaction.
is it not always going to be the case in foods and beverages that something can be measured either as a property or as an ingredient like this? Or is this a special case for ABV, or can we think of other cases where this kind of juxtaposition is happening?
Calories is another one.
Right. But
Well,
calories are different in that they're a measure of unit of energy, whereas alcohol is an actual ingredient. Calories are not an ingredient in something, whereas pure ethanol could be extracted and measured as an ingredient, but a calorie can't be extracted into a thing.
All right. So
Matthew, I would agree with you. Sorry, just to interrupt real quick. I would agree with you, Matthew. Another analog here would be amount of gluten in it versus, for example, IBUs, bitterness units. And IBUs is not an ingredient. It is a pure metric describing the amount of some property. Whereas gluten could be, you could put it either way, and I would sort of lean also to put it toward the it is a component.
all right. So let me go back to my annoying Rob soapbox questions. Ontologically, you're both right. Technically, you're both wrong. And this is the bizarreness of what we're doing, in that it's very, whether it is IBUs or whether it is ABVs or where it is calories, the mechanics and the problems of mechanics are the same, even though from an ontological perspective, they're different things. Because I can measure IBU or I can have a declarative attributes of IBU, but they are mechanically very different to implement. And that difficulty will easily go over to, say, barley.
I'm going to share.
Robert, when you say mechanically, do you mean the mechanics of calculation or do you mean the mechanics of food processing?
Okay, I'm going to share my screen here and just start naming some things, and we'll see if we can clarify some of these conceptual things. One thing I know is I know how to name a process, and I know how to name a piece of information the process generates. And I know how to name a material that's the input of the process. So I'm going to set that up right now. So we've got a green thing, which is probably the material thing, and so that would be some kind of liquid with alcohol in it, and we want to use that as an input to an assay of some kind that's going to measure what's in there. So I'm going to draw an arrow and get that going. I'm not sure why. There we go. So there we go. Here's our here's the material going to the process that does the measurement, and now we're getting out a measure of that. So this process could be measuring a variety of things. If we call it an ABV measurement process, what's it doing, and is there an industry standard around that?
Before we go there, that would be a sub that would also have a parent of measurement process, right?
Right. And then you could have some kind of hierarchy about kinds of measurement and so on. But
Right.
To answer your question, Damion, there is a standardized mechanism for that as specified in various regulations.
Mm-hmm.
In practice, people will use a number of homemade mechanisms to make that calculation also.
Okay. So regulation laboratory analytic processes or homebrew processes vary?
I would say chemical analytic.
Okay.
It's not necessarily in a lab. It could be in a kitchen.
Lab or at home. Okay, and so what can happen here is when we want to get precise about that, then we can start talking about a regulated analytic measurement, ABV measurement process, and so on, just to make that distinction and make that a subclass of this. And then have like the homebrew version as well. If that comes
Damion,
up
what's
in discussion.
Damion, what's the green box on the left?
Green, so I can pop a legend in here, but green, here it's some liquid we're applying to this ABV measurement process. Could be beer, could be some other substance. So
Wait, you're
Okay.
applying the liquid to the measurement process, or you're applying the measurement process to the liquid?
right, okay, to be precise, the liquid is an input to the measurement process. So I must admit I'm using a little OB ontology terminology. So as specified input would be the technical, the relation I choose here. And
For clarity's sake, Damion, on the green box, instead of ABV measurement, because that's what we have as an output on the right-hand side, you want to call it maybe beverage or food product or something like that?
right, thanks. Forgot I left that in there. Probably even just liquid.
Fine. Slurry.
Right. So yeah, so for example, if it comes up that some researchers studying whether the comparison of data between home measurement of ABV and some regulated measurement really vary, or whether some home process for doing that is sufficient, then that's why you would need these two terms to show up in that study. Okay, now back to you, Warren, about kinds of things that are output from this measurement process, and whether industry and whether time is involved, how we need to describe the context of this, and therefore create new classes that pertain to that on any one of these entities.
Okay, so let me make this extremely simple. Can you make just a circle that says beer instance?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that raises the question of whether we can talk at a class level or an instance level. So if I was being strict here, I would make a second layer that would talk about the instances of things, and I'll maybe just highlight them with dashed lines. And
No,
I'll call this.
I understand. I agree. I just want to have that on the screen so we can talk about it.
Okay, great. So here we have a beer instance.
Okay, and if you can put, say, GS1 ABV
On it?
as a, just put another box that says, I don't know, 1.2.
Okay, another.
Just put another box like a, excuse me, a literal.
Oh, you mean like a measure?
Yeah.
Okay, right. All right, so to use the convention, oops. Okay, let's bring up the menu.
I'm a little confused about what these bottom two blue boxes are, because they say exactly the same thing.
Okay, just a little explanation. So the ontology and its classes, you can sort of put in one kind of style, on the diagram. And then as soon as you start talking about the sentences that you're trying to compose, according to that ontology, you can make instances that are using or referencing or being types instances of those classes in your structure.
I understand, but these two boxes right here and right here are the same.
Oh, oh, right. Sorry. This is at home. This is supposed to be not regulated, but at home. Thank you.
Oh, and okay, so well, I don't know about home, but kitchen.
Right.
Verse. Okay.
Sorry
Yeah.
about that.
Robert, I think you were going to sort of zoom us out a little bit to put the big question back on the table so that we're all trying to design here to solve the same kind of problem, right?
Right. I'm just waiting after that. I just like to demonstrate something. I just need that diagram to do it.
Okay, so there's ABV. Did you mention a particular number?
Yeah, just 1.2 or something.
Okay.
And the arrow in between the two is just one.
You want an arrow, a beer instance to have something associated
Just to,
with it.
yeah, just point to ABV, and the property name is GS1 ABV.
I see. Okay.
And are we saying that we don't know what those property labels are up there between the blue squares?
This is by convention. Let's say a 2-pixel blue line is a relation.
Okay.
And all others are just more specific properties, not
All right, that's fine.
not class subclass. But.
That's fine.
So my concern is this. Commercially, the bottom 3 boxes with beer instance GS1 and ABV 1.2 are what we're getting. That's what's being pushed commercially. And if you speak to the computer of a person participating in a diet study, or where you're getting the full list of everything that they've bought off the store, that's the data you're going to get from them. So we need a way to be able to backtrack the fact that we have this point in time data back into something that Foodon understands. And what I'm really asking is this something that mechanically Foodon can support, or is this something that we'll do offline through another hack?
And you're saying the problem is because it changes through time?
Well, you're going to get that. I'm not saying that it changes through time. I'm just saying that these are static triples. So you're going to get that instance, that ABV. And there's obviously no way for you to actually give it any temporal aspect.
Mm-hmm. Robert, let me see if I can translate, just make sure I'm following you. If I meet with a researcher and they say the Berkshire Blonde beer that I'm testing has an ABV of 5% as measured on GS1 standards. It's a sort of flat data. They report it to me as though the ABV, the number 5, is an attribute of the Berkshire Blonde. And if we in Foodon want something else where the ABV is not the simple attribute of this overall product, but rather, for example, it's an ingredient, we would need some way to sort of convert that relatively simple flat data into something that is Foodon appropriate. And you're wondering if that's doable and if that's good. Am I following you?
You're following me. Frank, I'm going to stop you and let Franco take over. Francesco, would you like to take over?
Oh no, yeah. I mean, I understand that it's very difficult to model time, let's say, but I also understand that you are, Warren, talking about something like a study, let's say, in which, for example, from a questionnaire or something like that, you have this value as a result. Am I right?
Well, I'm not going to pronounce myself on the questionnaire. It's that commercially, that's what you're getting back. Therefore, if a person is going to give you all of his nutritional data and eating habits, this is what you're going to get, because that GS1 data is directly related to the barcode on a piece of food.
Okay. So basically, you need to read the data item in a sense, which contains these instance values of the GS 180 in the very end. It's not, I mean, it's not something like temporal related, but maybe different instances of data item produced by different assay, questionnaire, time in which you read the label or other process.
Again, I'm not going to pronounce myself on that process. What is published though online is that that triple.
Yeah.
So I'm not, in an ideal world, you would have temporal everything, but that's what we have commercially. And maybe the solution is to say, okay, fine, we will add that when we acquire, which is another solution that's possible. However,
I think I can comment on this now. So Foodon buys into the OBO Foundry and OB especially data item world, and in that data item world, you can name data items, say they're about something, and so in this case, I would just say that we're talking about a GS 180 ABV measurement as a class, and this is an instance of that class that has a value, and it's about this product, this sample, or this beer, or wherever it was. And the other, so I have Magali raising her hand, but I have one more thing to say to that, and that is that labeling as well can be a kind of information content entity, and labels can say whatever they want, and you can also have them be about instances of a product or classes of a product. So I don't see any barrier here to modeling. In a sense, you could just let me do diagrams, and I would do them according to the sort of OB way of marking up data items and processes. What's important for me is to make sure we're capturing the information and knowing that we're capturing the information for various stakeholders' uses wherever it's found in this food chain. But Magali, you have a comment.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everybody. Just a comment. I do not agree or understand why we are talking about GS1 ABV as a measurement. For me, it's not the measurement of the beer instance. It is the target. Just as T-Roy, I don't know the pronunciations, sorry, T-Roy mentioned that it is the end product characteristic. The GS1 measurement is the end product target.
Okay, so
it is not the measure you are making during the process. And so we have to represent, I think, the steps of the process where the measure is done.
Right. So if I read that correctly, GS180 ABV is more of a label on a product that is then echoing an ABV measurement that was made at some point in the process. I'm sort of confusing the two a little bit just to simplify, but we could separate this out and call it the GS180 label on a product that is about an ABV measurement that was taken at some point. But I think the key is there are these ABV measurements. They're made by processes that are either regulated or are done more informally. But we just need to know where they are done in the process and whether regulations are controlling categories somehow that are showing up in this. Matt, well, over to you, Warren, to handle.
All right, so we're not getting too ahead of ourselves. I'm going to change this around and say it's schema.org ABV. And it's the same problem here. The concern that I have here is it'll be interesting to see, because here your solution essentially, Damion, is to create another layer of triples and say, okay, I've derived this ABV label from schema or GS1 data. And then I'm going to infer the fact that I had a measurement process from it. Is that the solution you're proposing?
I guess I'd phrase it that I'm willing to diagram all the little points along this process from where information arises. And I think our business is to find out which stakeholders are interested in which parts, but we can give labels to all of those things to distinguish them, to make sure there's semantic clarity about what's being spoken of. So whether it's not that we need to have in these sentences that end up in RDF triple store databases, we don't need to have every single part here.
I'm sorry, I'm asking about the.
Let's model out what all the parts are, and then we can collapse into relations, whatever anybody wants to just sort of shortcut or simplify bits. Udon's interest is in having the sort of the full granularity, though we don't want to take any shortcuts.
Okay, I'm going to answer Troy. So there's two. Okay, so the question essentially goes on into another issue, is that there is what I'll call master data, for lack of a better word. And here, what we're doing is we're saying the label is the master data, and we derive the measurement process from it. So we infer there was a process that occurred because the label exists. And in some stakeholders, it's the other way around, because there was an ABV measurement during production. It met their standards. Then the substance was moved over to the bright tank. And at that point, that ABV measurement is what created a taxation payment to the government for the alcohol created. And at that point, that ABV measurement is what is going to create the labeling information for that batch. And that labeling is what is going to be sent to GS1 for distribution publicly. So you can look at it as a source, or you look at it as an output of processes.
I don't see why those things are in conflict. It's an output of a process, and itself is a source for a label and taxation classification.
You're right, there is no conflict. I'm not quite sure where, I don't know where you went with that.
Okay. I am a little confused, because I thought you were saying, is it this or that? And to me, it's a yes and, not an or.
Okay, I was referring to what Damion was diagramming, which exemplar he was going for.
Oh, I see. Okay, and I have a question. This GS 180 ABV label. So is 180 part of GS1, or is that something?
I think that's my audio connection. It should be GS1 ABV.
That's what I thought. Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
I get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Got it.
And it seems like we should also, I like the idea, if there's a GS1 label, yes. And also, if things are being classified at schema.org, we might want to capture that as well. because this is going to make a difference in how food on can or the fermentation ontology or the food processing ontology, whatever they end up being, can link into these other ontologies.
Yeah, let me clarify there. If I show a little data property like this here, that's not really what Foodon's going to do, but we would be looking at this as a translation. We would translate
Right.
it into, yeah. And totally acknowledging this is one of the missions here. When you bring a ontology like Foodon, which is based on the whole Ovo Foundry world, into direct contact with with the commercial reality, it means there's going to be translation. We just want to capture that granularity of the translation. We don't want to drop any times, any points in the process, and so on. People have their hands up still, and
Can I just finish my comment? Instead of kitchen there, I think there's a regulated process and there's an unregulated process.
Okay.
And that could be in any, the location is not necessarily important.
And
Roy, would you like to take over?
Thanks. I'm wondering, I'm not sure who this question is directed toward, but I'm wondering whether the the GS1 label has relationships to the measurement process. In other words, to qualify for a GS1 standard measurement, are there ways or times you have to make the measurement? Or is the GS1 simply the syntax for how you record the number that some process generated?
It's simply it's not a syntax. They are product attributes as reported to the merchant.
Cool. All right. So then GS1 is a language for the number. It's a way to articulate the number. And there are lots of processes that GS1 numbers could have been derived from, and therefore they're really pretty independent in an ontological sense, right?
Okay. Formally, GS1 is a vocabulary that it is OWL enabled, but that does not have any provenance or traceability for the data itself.
Okay, cool.
And so, totally happy to try to capture that kind of thing in Foodon. So we would be more than happy to have a GS1 ABV label and know that that could be a data item that has a value associated with it, and that's a translation of, say, a schema.org GS180 property pointing to ABV 1.2, for example.
May I?
Yes.
Just to add some water. I think I don't know who has made the question, but I don't think that GS1 ABV label is an ABV measurement. It is a category of products having a certain ABV, but I don't think it is the output of a measurement.
Right.
It is an output, but it is not a measurement.
Right. So.
But you have an end product ABV measurement, which should comply with the target GS1 ABV label.
So that could be another way of representing this on the fly, and is about relation between this label that's about this measurement and it's about this material entity. I'm sticking with general relations here, but we'll be forced to use more specific ones if ambiguity arises.
Damion, can you fix your GS180 down in the bottom left?
Right.
Okay, we have some lurkers that are being quiet. Would anybody else like to jump in and make some rash comments?
I think it would be worth. Oh, sorry. I'm speaking only because there was some silence. I think it would be worth working out the fermentation process a little bit more to see where these ABVs are being measured, to see which ones are of interest to regulators and which ones are of interest to brewers during the process and so on. Giving names to those.
Actually, one of the things that I would like to see added to fermentation process, from memory, we had something called a planned process at some point. I'd like to see something that says it's a planned process versus it's an unplanned fermentation.
Okay.
Because that has, one is something you're trying to do, and the other process is something where something has gone obviously awry and you're worried.
Okay. Okay. So how about we try to model the beer fermentation process and then allow that any one of those processes can fail, and have it that the unplanned process can be looked at as the studied as the as what happened in reality versus the plan. Natural, would you call it?
How about expected?
Expected? Well, we've got planned fermentation process over here.
All right. Yeah, Miguel, we couldn't hear that.
A planned process gives rise to an expected outcome.
Sorry, do you mean a planned process, planned fermentation process versus, let's say, unplanned, that is the natural fermentation process, which is not conducted or directed by men, let's say?
Are women also fermenting, or is it just men that are drafted?
So
what I really meant is what happens if you leave a glass of milk on the counter for 5 days versus I'm trying to make beer?
Right. So
Yeah, right.
natural, yes. So one of the things about this whole planned process business is that it depends often in biology on natural processes. So you can have a natural process model, and then this whole planning is about shutting it off or controlling its temperature or the catalysts or whatever. So
maybe instead,
to it.
Sorry then, instead of natural, you could use a spontaneous fermentation process.
Ooh, I like that a lot.
And maybe we can assume, think that in a planned fermentation process, you have some kind of controlled inoculum
Yes.
of microorganisms. Instead, in the spontaneous fermentation process, a fermentable substrate is simply fermented by the natural or the autochthonous, I don't know.
The wild.
Which would be the best, the wild, yeah, right, microbial community.
But I think sometimes they also plan the natural fermentation, right? In Belgium, they have beers that are spontaneously.
Yes, that would be one case of planned process in which you are deliberately choosing to not have an inoculum. But
So I don't think planned.
the whole process is planned, I think.
I'm not exactly sure where this debate is going, but it seems to me the important difference is whether the input to the process was a recipe or the input to the process is observation. Yeah, and in other words, I don't know what happened. I'm going to try and be a detective and find it out because I didn't follow a recipe, or I followed the recipe and other things happened. So maybe the process has inputs. It has the formulation inputs and it has other exogenous factors call it wild, call it unobserved, call it not yet understood.
Okay. This is a rabbit hole that we're aggressively going into. I had something a lot simpler in mind when I said this, and now I'm sorry to get us into trouble here. Really, I was looking at this as a process control perspective and saying everything went okay and I got what I wanted versus something went wrong and now I'm worried. And that sounds ontologically messy. However, from a food perspective and from a business perspective, it's life or death for a lot of people, literally. So that's why I had that differentiation. I'm sorry, Francesco, you just had your hand up. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. No, just a comment. I was thinking that this same, apart from this, let's say, think about fermentation, but this same schema about ABV may be well applied also, let's say, to food acidity. Like in that case, we will not be measuring ethanol or alcohol. We'll be measuring, for example, acetic acid. So maybe it would be worth to also try to be at the more generic level. So the same modeling can be applied to many other factors like the pH, the acidity, I don't know, the lactose concentration or something else, maybe anything else.
This was my point earlier. Exactly, Francesco. We're on the same wavelength. I was thinking specifically salt. Acidity, we could think of a number of these things that we measure, fat of various varieties, but also even down to the molecular components. If we really start getting into very specific fermentations for things like various lab-grown meats or milks. We're going to want to have very specific oligosaccharides and their measurements. We're going to want to have very specific bioactive peptides and their measurements. So I think that this is a percentage by volume is going to be both.
So Damion, it is now 1:45 by my watch, and I think we've exhausted all times for this particular part of the workshop. Is it time to jump on to the next one?
Damien's muted. Before he answers, I would like to capture the idea that Francesco said of spontaneous process somewhere in here on this map so it doesn't get lost. Because that was a really planned versus spontaneous, I think, is a really important contribution.
I think Damion found a side task he's enjoying right now, going deep on process.
Damion, are you talking and we're not hearing you?
Somehow my thing was on mute. Oh dear. Well, I was just going to say, just address that that notion of spontaneous process or natural. Cobb is a revisit of this plant process idea, and what OboFoundry is moving to as sort of the upper level ontology to put everything under. Biological processes sitting there, that's where fermentation would be. You try to model that out there. Plant process is all about putting controls on these processes or making use of them, setting their time and conditions. And there's now two states, the completely executed plan process and the failed plan process. So that's where we would box some kind of failure of beer fermentation. So I feel like we can leave it at that and then just focus back on getting the sample points that are important during this fermentation process and giving them unique names for the measurements at those points. And that way we eliminate any kind of confusion about what's being referenced. But Warren, over to you maybe for finishing comments and next steps on this. I'm sure you could get the whole group back here to continue the modeling.
Okay, so thank you for your time, folks. I appreciate that it was a bit of a pain to change the day at the last minute. My takeaway from this conversation is that there's various different stakeholders, and even in our discussion, it was evident that we use a different language just to talk about how the ontology and the data behaves. So I think there's a lot of value in pursuing the models here, because it allows us as different communities to talk to each other and to move data that has tremendous value around from purpose to purpose. This has been recorded. We have the beginnings of a graph that's been written up. Let's see how the next conversation goes on beer styles. And I will send an email at the end of the week around and see if we want to have a second session and to iron out a few more details.
That sounds great. Okay, that puts us in, we can take about a 10-minute break and then return with the rest of the work.
Okay, thank you. So what we're going to talk about, we're going to stimulate some discussion on the whole fermentation model, trying to put some attention on which would be, let's say, the upper level, the higher level concept, and then we will talk about a bit about beer styling, and so the classification of an example of a fermented product. So I think that some of the elements were already briefly touched in the previous section. So first of all, the first question we could be asking is, what is a fermentation? And I will say that we will have no objection in interpreting the fermentation basically as a process. So as a process, we let's say that there was already a bit of modeling of the fermentation process into the food. Here we see some schema that we may be talking a bit later and a bit about it later. We have already into food, for example, a set of fermented food product based on the different kind of products. So we have fermented vegetable product. We have, for example, fermented dairy food product. We have fermented beverages. So a classification based basically on the end product, on the type of product. And I will, in a bit, we will see, I would, let's say, stimulate discussion on a bit different of classification of the type of fermentation. So putting a bit together the concept, we have, we see the fermentation basically as a process. We can define it in a variety of ways. So as a process, we have some ingredient which are input of this process, and this process as, let's say, protagonist, as player, I would say main player, but at least very important player as microorganism, and the output of this process is defined as the fermented food.
Just to note, Francesco, there's
yeah.
a little gray box on your slide on the right-hand side. We see, I'm not sure.
It should be the...
that helps.
Okay, it was the
right, the people
the chat, let's say. Okay, sorry about that. I was thinking that only the slide was shared. Okay. So each part of this, let's say, schema can be further modeled or organized. And we can, for example, be interested in model the ingredient, so the input material of this process. And in this part, we could be, let's say, discussing or using the tradition, the history, and the geography of a place to categorize the product. For example, the banana beer is something which is typical of some places in Africa, but I don't think, at least not be found in Europe or in Italy, for example, maybe also in America. So a set of, let's say, the ingredients and the fermentable substrate determine the beer style. And these beer style are connected to concept like tradition and history, but also obviously to laws and regulation of a place. Some processes may be quite simple, like the sort of refreshing, which is a simple process that can be made at home, but also simple process can be difficult in some sense. For example, in the one thing that is strange or difficult in the soda fermentation is that and in many other fermentation is that the input of the process is the same as or at least part of the output of the previous batch. So that makes the fermentation some sort of cyclic process, and the process of backsloping is used to do some other fermentation. So this is just to say that also simple schematic representation of a fermentation that can be made at home, it's not that simple in reality as conceptualization and as modeling, because we have the output of the previous batch of fermentation, which is not very easy to model. So we have a process we have already so that process can be easy or can be very difficult and very elaborated and industrial. But what I care the most about as a biologist and as a microbiologist is that this process, at any kind of process, at some point has the action of microorganisms, so the biological action of microorganisms. And when we open that box, a lot of different layer of complexity can be seen, because biological processes are basically very complex. We did some initial, let's say, work on this for a recent publication we made on the dairy fermented food. And so, for example, one point that I want to bring to you for discussion is that instead of, let's say, representing the food fermentation process on the light of the end product, maybe we could, at the very upper level, represent which are the components, the chemicals, the entity that are fermented. So the whole fermentation process from a biological perspective can be on the glucose, for example. So it's made of metabolism, can be on the glucose, on the protein, on the lipid. And all of these different metabolism have consequences for the fermented food. For example, the glucose metabolism in wine production would bring the decrease of the glucose and the increase of the alcohol, for example, but other kind of fermentable substrate like protein are responsible for all that surround alcohol, so for the aroma, for the bouquet. And it's very important for the fermented food, for the final food product. Why it is complex? Because in microorganisms, let's say, are doing all of this to produce energy and to, let's say, prosper. And they do this by, let's say, biological mechanism and by pathways, what we call pathway. But basically, they do this by using something which can make actions, which are the enzymes, and which have action on specific substrates. So again, when we open the box and we go to the biological process, we can go down from the very upper level of the metabolism on the glucose to the very low level of which are the, for example, biological pathways which are involved. So we know, for example, which are the enzymes, which are the genes that are involved in the process. And we can detail, for example, we may think that the lactose is the input of the process, but it's not the input of the general process. We need to break the lactose into the glucose, for example, and so on. And then at the end, we have the lactic acid. In this case, we were, let's say, dealing about the kefir fermentation. Another important thing and another point of discussion which in which the microorganisms are the main player is for what we could call the services that the microorganisms give in the final product. This of the service of the microorganisms is a concept which is popular, let's say, or used in the environmental sciences. And I think that we can also apply it here. So services is a general concept regarding what good action, good things the microorganisms are doing for us. For example, in the soil domain, one service would be the carbon recycle. In this case, one service, for example, is the preservation of a fermented food, because the action of the microorganism produce an increase in the pH, for example. So again, we can connect processes measurement to the very action of the microorganism. Then another layer of in which we could be interested, or in which we could focus our action, is on obviously the categorization of the fermented food. And for example, in this case, we will talk mainly about the beer styling. So let's say categorizing the beer style, what they entangle, which are their characteristics, for example, from various point of view. So again, we can have some cultural and common language, which then, let's say, clashes or go hand in hand with the technical aspect on the fermentation, which define the styles, the beer styles. And also, as this was done on some initial drafting and modeling of, for example, the wine fermentation, the whole wine production from the very initial input material, which in this case is the grape and the process of the grape harvesting, to finally the fermentation process, and also other type of all industrial process that we can think of. So as a final notice, before let's say switching to discussion, there's a set of questions I think we have to answer when starting to work on a more general fermentation ontology. So first of all, it would be useful to understand which are the user base, so which are the user interested in this kind of ontology. It's more industry, it's more research, it's more focused on regulation, because then we, I think, can skip, or we can not skip, sorry, we can change how we model things based on which is the audience most interested in the ontology. Another thing that we may discuss is if one solution can fit all, or if we need single resources. So do we need a wine ontology, a beer ontology, a dairy fermented food ontology, or we could, I say ironically, develop a basic fermentation ontology? This is like more ironically referring to the basic formal ontology. So a set of upper level concepts which are general for every fermentation process. And as a microbiologist, I will say that what is general to any fermentation process is the biological process which are behind the industry. And then have a set of other domain-specific ontology taking on those general upper level concepts. So having, let's say, introduced in a sense which are the open, which are the open, let's say, question, which are the open, the discussion point, I will leave the floor to anyone which has something to say. Thank you. Okay, I see that Matthew has the first hand raised, so go ahead.
Thanks. Totally awesome. Totally excited about this. Really, really great. So I was, thinking about what you were saying here the whole time and cohering it with what we just did in the previous session, and thinking about what Damion showed as the process. And I kept going back to this concept of spontaneous process and wild ingredients. I do think that we actually probably, and I agree with you that we need an upper level fermentation ontology, absolutely. And in fact, there were a few items. Fermentation is a biological process, but there's also physiochemical processes going on there. There's lots of other aspects of those processes that are involved in fermentation. So I do think that we need to revisit the way that OBO is currently looking at processes in general and thinking about spontaneous fermentations versus planned fermentations as different kinds of processes, being spontaneous processes versus planned processes, and breaking it down certainly into the organisms and the substrates and everything. That's all fantastic, and then there's other aspects that we can get into, which I have a feeling, because it looks like Robert's raised his hand, but methods, cultural methods, containers. What are we fermenting inside? Are we fermenting inside a pig's stomach, or are we fermenting inside of, something else, inside of a stainless steel container, right? So those things are going to make a difference. So the environment, and then there's a whole cultural component around all of that as well that I think is super important. But this is a really great start. Thank you for kicking it off so well.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. So we have Robert.
Thank you for that. Fantastic. Great intro. And I'm new to the ontological world, but I've been studying fermentation for the past 30 years, primarily in Asia. And a couple things. One is you asked about the users, and I see industry research and regulations. I think something that ties into making ontologies more widespreadly used or more used in a larger audience is education. Because if you think about what you're mapping here for food science programs, for culinary programs, for cultural food programs, food studies in general, taking what you're all doing and actually implementing it now that so many people are doing fermentation, whether it be in their kitchen, their lab, or what have you, I think you want to add education to one of those user groups, because not just the modeling, but what I liked when I first saw Damion's, the wine one, the food on there, is just the introduction of some graphics to make it more palatable by people that aren't ontologists from a scientific level, brings a lot of value. And so, yeah, I think that, and then from the culture, so that's one part, the users. Another group, education. Secondarily, from the cultural side, I understand about the ingredient, the process, and the output of fermented food. What I think would be interesting, and I don't know if it's appropriate for this discussion, is based on the ingredient, the process, and the result, something like Tobanjan from Szechuan, the way in which it's made, the color, the resulting color, texture, because of age, vessel, actually has cultural norms associated to it. So if it's for this long in this color, these are the dishes it's been traditionally used for hundreds of years. So I think adding a fourth step to that of application, uses, cultural norms would be something interesting. I don't know if that's appropriate. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So Matthew, with a reaction to the proposal of the education layer, and I would say, yeah, it's interesting. I see your comment also on graphics. Then we have Damion, which raised the hands. Go ahead.
And so, Robert, I think it's entirely appropriate to push to push the ontology community around food out of just the life sciences and into culture. But then, of course, it becomes a language and relationship problem. How do we describe those kind of processes? Adding more language in about cooking, preparation, and context. And so another activity at this conference here has been the social science ontology development and around behavior. But even that's not quite enough. You need to get into history and culture too. I would like to just reiterate, there is this biological process term in OboFoundry and in COB now. That's where natural processes are meant to be modeled. So maybe we have to create a term still, natural fermentation, but Go has a fermentation term, I believe. I just checked a moment ago. So sure, model a bit more about how plant processes control that, and totally interested in that. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, a note on spontaneous, let's say, versus industrial fermentation. If you go down to the microorganism level, basically it would be the same. I mean, what changes is what is around, because the metabolism would be the same. The glucose metabolism, the way in which the cell take on the sugar or similar. What is different, it's basically maybe the genetics of and the complexity of the microorganism which are used. Natural fermentation, spontaneous fermentation usually are community. It's not a single strain. So our community which are acting and are contained in the environment, in the containers, in the starting material, which are not sterile, let's say, in a sense. While industrial process usually needs to have a precise outcome. So maybe need a precise inoculum. It's not true for all the fermentation. And that's also something which is related to the sorry, I don't remember how it's called in English, to the DOP, the protected origin denomination. So for example, in Parmesan, what I was in this work that we did in the dairy fermentation, let's say, domain, I was very surprised that by regulation, the Parmesan has not a real inoculum. So you can't say, okay, tomorrow I want to start a Parmesan cheese factory. You simply cannot do it because you need the backsloping process. So you need to have the product in-house without thinking about regionality or something like that. You can simply do it because there is not an inoculum. While, for example, in the kefir fermentation, you can buy the inoculum, and tomorrow or you can start an industry on your own if you want. I see there's some raised. We have Warren, I think first with a raised hand. Go ahead.
So it occurs to me that what a lot of things that we're talking about and a number of these comments. So for example, wine, the type of wine is often defined by the grapes that are in use. The type of beer is often defined by the ingredients that are in use. the type of fermentation is often defined by the specific style of process that is in use. So it almost sounds like we have subclasses that really restrict what goes into the beer or mandate that something be done during that fermentation process. So there's an opportunity here into declaring that the process is a specialization and the name implies that something has happened.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if we had first the chat or the we got with the hands raised. So Troy next.
Thanks, Francesco. It seems, obviously, in the world of ontology, we create models to describe things as we know them or as we want to describe them. But of course, there's a lot of things we don't know. And especially with something like fermentation, a lot of the magic is happening in ways or with microorganisms that we don't understand yet. And that's part of the, and so I have a slightly more general question for the group. And that is, in Food On, do we have, or should we have, a box, a class, a sector for things that are unknowns, known unknowns, sort of like the magic happens box, if you will, so that we have a way of describing what we do know, but leaving a formal place for the things where more research is needed, frankly, on the biochemistry even. I'm just, thoughts about that?
I guess I'll react to that. So the Obo Foundry kind of operates in the open world. So it certainly acknowledges that there are other objects and entities out there that it may not know of, and the whole logic engine is sort of skewed towards that. But what you won't find very easily is some codified way of expressing hypotheses, theories about things, and possible evidence supporting. There's evidence ontology, I think, has something to do with that. But in terms of known unknowns, we can't name things that are not known. We can only just miss with our theories about how things work. So you would have to give me some more tangible examples of how to do that. One thing I will say is that we don't put the word other in any of our terms, or we try to stay away from that. The reason is the parent category is for any class, the parent class is supposed to cover all those other cases, and the children of that class are just more specific ones that we do know about. So we just revert to referencing the parent if there's some unknown subordinate. So maybe that's the on-target answer for you.
Thanks, Damion. Very helpful.
So I just left this one diagram on in terms of the knowns and the unknowns. What Food On has for knowns are those top 3 items with the IDs. All of the other Food On fermentation processes that don't have IDs aren't actually in the ontology and don't have definitions, and I don't know anything more about them. So it requires a curation process to get that level of process detailed into Food On's process hierarchy. And it requires, it's helpful, it's nice if we can actually model the inputs and outputs and come up with names for those materials, those liquids and others, nutrients. And maybe that helps, maybe some paths through this help with the beer styles curation. So we can easily come up with a list of beer styles and name them, but maybe then that's highly dependent on naming the fermentation steps. And Magali
I think this is just a good transition, because I was just stating that we have not spoken about quality, and just to react to the excellent comment by Francesco, thank you for the nice overview of fermentation also, by the way. And so I think that even if natural spontaneous fermentation implies the same metabolism, I think that you have huge differences in the end product qualities. So we have to work on this, and this is exactly what beer style can be an example of different end product qualities.
What is an example of that?
I think if we are working now on beer style, it will give
Beer style,
some,
right? Okay, right.
some ideas.
Matthew.
So, to build on what Magali was just saying, and I always love your comments, Magali. I think if we can hone in on the process and what are the right, because one of the issues at a food science, food engineer kind of scale up issues that people have is that fermentations get stuck, fermentations go awry, things happen, and we don't always know why. And even so, we have these planned processes, but we don't get the expected outcome from the planned process. And so mapping this out to the degree that we can, it could be a failed planned process, but there's no, it stops there. That ontology stops right there. And what I would like to see is actually the ability to understand where it failed, why it failed, and the more that we can model this process ontologically, the better off we'll be. So I would say that there's room in that process ontology that you were just clicked on over there in the OLS. There's room to expand on that, and it may not. I'm not sure. I mean, failed is such a heavy term. There could be aspects from the fermentation that were good, but could be better, right? So how do we optimize our fermentation processes? And I don't see a way in the OLS representation that you were showing a second ago, Damion, to talk about optimizing those processes. And Magali, correct me if I'm wrong, but is that along the lines of what you're thinking is essentially fermentation optimization?
Yes, you are right. Oh, do you hear me? Yes. Yep. Yes, I think we are on the same line because we have talked about natural processes, but we also have the not so good controlled one, as you said, and also the goal is to optimize. Actually, yes, you are right. I think I agree.
Yeah. Can I react to that? Or Francesco, go ahead.
No, go ahead, and then I will return to Matthew.
Okay, I think it's so trying to figure out what optimization of a process means. It means you're either adjusting an objective some way, and that objective can be some quality of the output, or it can be a time or efficiency or material resource efficiency thing. All of that's taking us straight to modeling the actual processes. So it's just, let's get down to business, roll up our sleeves and start modeling. And then that reveals those variables and dimensions that can be toyed with. And Magali's whole, her research institute is all with its PO2 ontology is all about formalizing those parameters so you can play with them, right?
But I think that the optimization has to do with the real of the instantiation level, because you have to have data, and also perhaps I was not so clear, but yes, perhaps optimization is more linked to data. But what we can do is to state what was the objective and how the objective has been achieved without speaking of optimization. So far, but perhaps how do we achieve the objective of the process as you have started to model in the process modeling proposal you have made?
where I was finding going with Trini and I trying to look at process objectives is that it's naming, it's actually naming qualities of outputs or characteristics of outputs, or it's actually naming energy and frequency of application. So it's just diving right into the details of that. Francesco, your
Okay, so getting to what Matthew was saying, that sometimes fermentation get broken, go wrong, or similar. I think that given the data-rich, let's say, era in which we are living, I think that if we can model and we can set things down, knowing the community at the start, knowing the temperature, pH, or other property of the process, knowing metabolomics, or at least some characterization of the starting material, those failure could be predicted, or at least we could have some ways of understanding them and responding to this kind of occasion. I'm not an expert in let's say, the food industry, but I know that sometimes, for example, in wine fermentation, you have some very bad behavior of the malolactic fermentation respect to the alcohol, which starts too soon. But if you know the pathway, if you know the metabolism, and you know the bacteria and the condition, maybe we can at some point arrive to predict these things.
I'm interested in the question of where just a biological description of things, however well controlled or to what aim, differs from this talk about cultural naming of beer styles as an example of how biologists would call one thing, but somehow it's made more complex than just synonyms. When it comes to industry or culture, to name that very same thing. Does that sound scary to me and complicated?
I'm just going over the chat a bit, and I see a question by Troy, which is, I think, similar to also what Megali was saying, which I find very interesting. I'm reading if Troy, if you want to take on the microphone, go ahead. But basically, the question or the comment. So go, Troy, if you want, go.
No, Francesco, you keep the microphone. Keep going.
I think that the question is, or the comment, the question is, I think the first major need here might be for food processor that wants to simulate, replicate the beneficial results that come from more traditional recipes. So it's very interesting this here from a microbiologist point of view, let's say, because we, and also working in the health general domain, we know that traditionally fermented food are beneficial. And I don't think that we can really replicate this into the industrial world, because industry needs control, and maybe what was beneficial in the traditional recipe was that black box of uncertainty around what can happen during fermentation, what is the community of today respect to the community of tomorrow. So I think that this is something interesting, and I want to throw let's say an argument, a discussion point also here, which I briefly touched also while I was introducing. We know basically that fermentation food are good. So do a fermentation ontology, would a fermentation ontology be obliged or need to also talk about health consequence or not?
I have an immediate knee-jerk reaction to that. um, I think that maybe for now, those things are separate because the health components are a result of not just consuming the thing, but the pattern of consumption. So there, everything is a poison in the appropriate dose. And, I think that was what Paracelsus said that a long time ago. I didn't come up with that, right? So there's that concept that there are no bad foods, only inappropriate consumption patterns of those foods. And so I'm not sure that, certainly we can associate specific outputs with say alcohol or salt or whatever an output of any food processing is with what might be considered appropriate healthy consumption pattern. But I'm not sure that health itself belongs inside of the fermentation ontology, as it were.
Matthew, your comment reminds me of a discussion we had at this conference a year ago about the pluses and minuses of the so-called Western diet, where we say, or just diets in general, or the nutritional aspects of food. And to bring it back to this conversation, one of the things that obviously that makes a food healthy, or that gives it the potential to be healthy or unhealthy, is its components, literally what's in it, right? And to some degree also the processes that it went through, especially if those processes make impacts on the foods that are hard to see through its ingredients, overly processed flour, for example, or what have you. And now I'm thinking about fermentation. Fermented foods are partly good for us because of the microbes that they absorb, so to speak, and or they're good for us because of the process they went through. So if we in the food world want to communicate what is in a food so that the health studiers have what they need to start analyzing, how healthy is this thing, we'll want to communicate to them both its components and the process it went through. And that's true for fermentation too, I think, especially for fermentation, because a lot of the goodness comes from microbes or ingredients that we don't know about. And the best way to describe them is just to say it sat out in the air for a while in China. The process is the closest we have to describing the ingredients in many cases, because the ingredients are so unknown. And so I'm thinking, Francesco, to your point, ultimately, the best solution here is to get ever better about articulating the ingredients. So adding as many microbes as we know about, because Damion won't let me put a box on there that says "and other microbes," but also to get as good as we can about communicating the process to them, including things like, I did this traditional, culturally grounded method, which by the way has this color of clay pot in this region of China, because that might be the best key to the nutritionist.
Yeah, thank you. And another provocation in a sense. What about regulation and labeling, like fermented product with certain health claims? This could be a problem or something that we might want to touch. Go ahead.
Before we go there, can we go back to health for a second, Francesco? I'd like to respond.
Sure. Sorry, yeah, sure. Thanks.
Sorry, Warren, to jump in front, but it's just related to the previous topic. So I hear what you're saying about sometimes we only know the process. and that's all that we have, and that's important, and that may relate to health claims, generalized health claims that Francesco's about to talk about, which I think are critically important, especially in terms of allowing food producers to make claims, to raise the value of their food through those claims. But we need to be very, very careful about that. There are some when a fermentation can go wrong in ways that you don't know about. And I will give you, for instance, in China, there was an example of an entire town that for 2 generations had a fermentation going wrong. They thought they were making something that was very healthful. And in fact, they ended up giving themselves throat cancer for a significant period of time. So without knowing what those molecules are, I would say we would not want to ontologically tightly couple the process of fermentation with health benefits, that we should actually wait to know what those molecules are before we tie those things together. There's a little pushback.
Just something, yes, it's Magali. Just to comment, I do agree, because there's not only good boys, they are also bad boys. But you bad guys, or I don't know. But yes, you have both aspects of microbiology, and so we should also keep it rational. Let's say just describing what exists and not what might be. So at the time we know what we know, so we have a lot to describe already, and I think the idea is the direction is done, but we have to proceed and to describe things we know first, and then go on. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to jump onto this notion of health benefits. So there are 2 grossly types of health benefits that I know of. The first one is when you talk about the nutritional aspects of the food. So for example, this glass of orange juice is X% of your optimal daily intake of vitamin C. The second one is a general health benefit claim, such as, drinking cranberry juice is good for your bladder. Again, I'm going to pull in Magali onto this one, but most of these claims are heavily regulated within the jurisdiction. And while claims such as X% of your vitamin C as a measurement that is relatively simple to get into labeling without complexity, saying that this cranberry juice will help your bladder is actually a regulated statement that has to be backed up by the state. And for certain aspects of the products, for example, saying light beer means something about the actual calories of your beer. And again, this is regulated at the state level. So I would like to see this approach to this where we can say, this is a generic health benefit according to this particular authority.
I don't see a hand up, so I'm just going to speak. I would like to do that. I think that's a separate exercise. I have a vested interest in that. I've built health claims databases. You described 2 different types of health claims as they are regulated in the United States. You described essentially a molecule claim, and you described a structure function claim. 2 very, very different things in terms of how they are regulated. The difference between the orange juice, a vitamin C example, and the cranberry juice. So that is a whole other ontology modeling exercise that isn't just for fermented foods, it's for all kinds of foods. And I think that it might be outside the scope of what we're doing here.
One quick move one can do is just focus on labeling. That's more at the product end.
So for example, one of the concerns that I have here is we're saying, okay, there is a health benefit to this fermentation. There needs to be some kind of documentation to that. Because I can, you're not really modeling at that point. You're making a statement of fact. And we need to provide some kind of hook into some other information source in order to document that.
I may add that if we are talking about regulation, we can also add the specification, let's say the list of ingredients that are authorized, or you mentioned labeling, you mentioned label, the name you are allowed to use on the label is also sometimes regulated. And so and about this, we have regulation, we have documentation, but it depends. It actually depends on the country or the region. So you have to add this also.
Mm-hmm. So that actually comes on a little bit under the appellation category. We just did a little bit of charting out about appellations and what they can pertain to geographically, and just what bacteria, or sorry, what kinds of wine.
Yes, but that is more specific to PDO, and there is also the more general label, which is common product, let's say, but which are also defined by the law.
Yeah, I'd like to suggest that we do a session like this on health claims, writ large, and stick to fermentation here, because there are other people who are experts on health claims that we can bring into this conversation who are not here today.
I agree.
Including attorneys.
Okay, so sticking back to more fermentation related discussion about the 2 to 3 points that I was raising in the end. What do you think about this and how we should do this eventually? This trying to have an upper level ontology which talks about any fermentation, and then so switching, let's say, the attention to from the final product to the general steps or general aspect of fermentation, then go into specific more domain, I would say domain, but it's not also the other, it's not really a general ontology, but let's say more focused ontology on, for example, wine or, for example, beer. So, for example, how should we start doing this, or if it is something which is good or not? Warren has his hands raised.
So I think that I believe in the upper level ontology for fermentation, and maybe I don't believe it's its own ontology, but classes that say that, yes, this is a fermentation. And there are generic aspects of that I would like to have available for a beer, at least. So I think there's some value in generalizing some aspects of this. And, maybe there is one small thing that I'd like to see is what's the source of the fermentation, or what are the causes of the fermentation in this particular process?
Francesco, when you showed us that one diagram of fermentation with glucose and the other intermediate products, I couldn't tell looking at that whether that was just for alcohol fermentation or that covered all sorts.
No, the idea that article was for dairy industry. So we basically in Kefir we have some alcohol fermentation if we want to, but we were not modeling alcohol there. We were rather modeling lactose decrease. So the idea is that if you stick to the molecules in some ways, you are really general, because you have carbohydrates, you have glucose, you can classify at various levels, obviously, but you have protein, you have lipids, which can be, and we also tried, as again, in that case, the subject was the dairy industry. And there is, there is a big difference in a fresh cheese, like a fresh dairy product like kefir, and a ripened dairy product like Parmigiano Reggiano. And one of these differences is that the glucose metabolism basically happens first, and in in fresh dairy product, it's the main metabolism. Instead, in the ripened products, we have other metabolism which came later, because one of the difficulties that the condition changed, for example, the pH, the amount of water change, and so the community change, and so the metabolism change. So we switch from the glucose to, for example, the protein, and we have the development of the aroma, of the taste, of the texture. So again, going to this, the fact that the microbial action, it's maybe the real common point of basically all fermentation, and can be an upper level, a real upper level. We have Matthew with his hand raised, then Troy.
Yeah, just take that a little. I do think there's no such thing right now as an upper level application ontology, but I think in some ways we need that. I think it's not at the level of food on necessarily. We're all talking about it related to food, but lots of things are produced through fermentations, including pharmaceuticals, biopolymers. All kinds of novel materials are produced through fermentations. So what we produce, we don't want to be necessarily food specific. So I would argue that we should be designing this with food in mind for us, but also with the idea that that we're building this more generally for something that can be a generalized solution for fermentation, and that will as a design constraint, I think that will force us to make a better fermentation ontology.
Okay, we have Troy, then Damion, I think.
Yes, there are some really amazing fermented foods that are made through what appear to be simple traditional methods. And one of the things that a lot of food industry probably is going to want to do is find ways to get the magic, to replicate the magic. I'm wondering if for people who have studied some of these processes for some foods more than I have, and for the people in this group that understand what our ontology already can do, can our fermentation process modeling, does it have room and ways to describe the things that traditional cultures are doing with their fermented foods? In other words, does the cultural process have a way to be described through our existing model? Or are there things we can learn about, entities, classes, we try and use it to describe these things? Maybe it's good to start with an example, or maybe people have a reaction to that.
If I can
react to that.
I can.
Or Magali,
Just
go.
a few things. I think you are totally right. I think we have to describe also traditional way of fermentation, but I don't think it is so much different in modeling. In fact, it is perhaps simpler because we don't have so much information, but we know what are the main steps involved in the process. We may know, I don't know. So I think it is the same mechanism to describe things, either traditionally or industrially made. I don't know if you agree with that, but that's my point of view.
Yeah, yesterday morning, of course, or afternoon, we had the ingredient substitution and recipe model session. And that's really essentially like tweaking a recipe. So the whole recipe model, I would expect to be pushed in that direction, being able to capture exactly what steps somebody goes through, what resources they're using, how long the corn cob stayed under the sun, and all that kind of stuff should all be part. It's all part of generic process modeling. Parts of. Basic question, naive, simple question to you, technical fermenters, Francesco. Can we break a fermentation process? Can we call it a linear thing in that it's just one set of fermentation stage after another to get to some endpoint? And if so, is the essence of modeling fermentation just being able to model one step of that process to its ultimate degree of conditions of fermentation, the biota going in, the energy, the resources going in, and so on. And that modeling one cycle then gives us the generic model with which we can model an entire sequence of more complex fermentation. So your diagram, for example, showed one chemical transformation happening as a result of one stage. So just modeling that one stage allows us to make a linear model out after that. If that's true, then it's not quite so challenging in my mind to try to get it right. So causally upstream of, so that activity, those stages, are those like separated stages, or is this all happening at once?
Okay, so you're referring at this, let's say this here.
Mm-hmm.
The fact is that the fact is that it's not so linear when you go down to the I think at least it's not so linear when you go down to the metabolic process. I mean, this is something that we try to model what must be the sequential, let's say, constraint, because in a sense I cannot metabolize the glucose if I don't first take it out from the lactose. And then we have the next step, which is the output from the first and the other. But we also were a bit constrained in a sense about how those entities in the gene ontology were defined. So, for example, the canonical glycolysis as a pathway was defined as having the glucose and the pyruvate as output. And then to go to the lactic acid, we found this other pathway. So this is true for example, homolactic fermentation. We can do something like that, but I think that we also need to explode, in a sense, to enrich our knowledge about those boxes. Because here we have a box and the box refers to a pathway. And a pathway is a complex set of, let's say, substrate, enzyme, product, and so on in a sort of, not cyclic, and it's not, but in a coordinated way, in a sense. The fact that if we manage to do something like that, I think we can better predict what, what, for example, also Matthew or in other places we were talking, if we know the steps of these little boxes here in detail, we can predict how the process is going, for example. Now I'll stop sharing it so I can see, okay. I don't know if I sort of answer your question.
Yeah, you did. So it's not just one bacteria being fed and then they produce something and you just try to keep them maximized for some period of time to produce. Going deeper involves lots of cyclic little process parts.
I'm just going to. I was starting to be a little in the dark. So yes, as Robert is writing in the chat, there are other, the complexity is that all of this is happening at the same time from a community. So it's complex to also see where, in a sort of competitive way. So the same substrate in some condition can go in a pathway, but if condition changes, can go into another pathway because it's more convenient for the energy production, for example. And so, yeah, we have the differences in different fermentation, maybe also batches.
So this leaves me thinking there's only very, very broad things one can say about fermentation, Matthew, as a general model. It sounds like the most general model is that you've got a process with the bacterial community in it. And as you power this process with resources, you end up with perhaps the same amount of bacteria, or maybe it's multiplied manifold ways because of the inoculum. But that you can only promise that there's some kind of transformation happening to the product, to some matrix or substrate, and that's about it at a general level.
Well, a couple things about what you just said, Damion. One is it's not always bacteria. Sometimes it's yeast.
Sorry, yeast. Yeah.
Sometimes it's bacteria. Right. Sometimes it's fungus. Yeah. Right. So we have to be careful about the names that we're using. But the organism, I think, is important, and certainly at the application layer, we want classes of organisms and the types of fermentations that they engage in, whether it's an alcohol fermentation or a malolactic fermentation, or whatever the case may be, also nutrients are important for those organisms as well. So the degree to which we separate substrate from nutrients, well, it depends on what the substrate is, sometimes for what the nutrients are going to be needed. So that can actually get kind of complicated.
That's what I'm getting at. So at the most general level, it sounds like, not that I'm not trying to discount the value, but at the most general level, we can say a fermentation process has some organism or family of organisms, some substrate, and some food resource, and that's about it. Maybe that it's applied for some amount of time and with some environmental conditions, and that's it for generalization. As soon as you jump off that, you're now into specifics of a particular kind of organism and its needs.
Well, but we want to understand that machinery of the organism and the classes of machinery in the organism. So part of the reason the organisms differ is because they have different enzymes that are capable of doing different things. So I'd say we don't want to stick at just the organismal level. We want to actually go down into what are the genes of the organisms, and how are those genes expressed, and how those genes are expressed are actually going to be different based on the environment, the salinity, the heat, the all different factors. So it's a little more complicated than what you're saying.
I'm not saying it's not complicated. I'm just saying we can't call it just a one level box. Then as soon as you get out of that one box, you're now into maybe 100 boxes based on each organism. So it just sounds to me like if we'll be able to abstract something very general, but then as soon as we step off that and start into each kind of organism, then it's its own modeling enterprise.
Right. I'm suggesting that maybe there's a more generic level that is suborganism, that is not about specific organisms, but about the machinery in those organisms, specifically enzymes.
Now, so Francesco, does that ring?
Yeah, I'm really looking for your response here, Francesco.
Yeah, maybe I understand what Damion is saying, because it appears that we can model it as some sort of black box, but we lose a lot of information. And I understand that going down to the organism may be too complex, because we need to understand the genome of the organism, the condition. Maybe for each kind of let's say kind of fermented food, what really is the upper level and what really can be applied in a more general sense is, as Matthew was saying, the machinery. But I will talk more with pathways than with enzymes, because pathways combine enzymes and compounds, and that's something which is very recognized in the biology domain. And that's why we did it with the gene ontology, because it's the ontology of the pathway. Just that also it appears complex, but it's way more complex if you take those pathway and you see that inside there are other processes. But I think that one good level of approximation, in a sense, could be to go to the gene ontology pathway, to understand that, because in that way we can really focus, for example, in the model about the dairy fermentation. For me, and I think also for the industry, could be interesting to understand the very input material into the fermentation process is not the lactose. If you use microorganisms that can't break the lactose, you will not have fermentation, right? Because you don't have glucose. So that's something that hypothetically you may choose for your fermentation an inoculum with a bacteria that it's not capable of using the substrate that it can find in your fermentable substances. So maybe you need other microorganisms. You need to choose another inoculum, or to choose a community, for example.
Yeah, so sorry to jump in front of you, Damion, but I just want to ask a question about what Francesco just said. So are we saying that we want to have classes of organisms in a different way than they've been classed phylogenetically, but we want to actually have classes of organisms based on what they're capable of fermenting in some ways, right? I think that would be a useful thing. So classes of organisms that are capable of consuming lactose, for instance, or reduced sugars, or whatever it is, right? So if we can begin thinking in those terms at an upper level about what it is that the organisms are capable of consuming, and environments that they're capable of operating in. If I want to
use a fermentation to bioremediate soil that's full of toxic compounds, you know, I need to know what kinds of environments that those organisms are capable of living in. So what the organisms are capable of living in, what they're capable of eating, what they're capable of producing, those, I think, classes of molecules, right? They're outputs, Robert, exactly. So classes of molecules that they're capable of producing, that would, I think, be really, really interesting if we can think about that. And that's all I would say at the same upper level that you were talking about, Damion, existing up there. Because they could be striped across organisms and organism types.
Yes, Matthew, as usual, it was the what you say is roughly what I was thinking, but no. Just to comment, I had in mind that there are already some classification, for example, homolactic or hetero, and so on. So that's roughly what you said. We must base our generic classification on the capabilities, let's say, as you say. And also in your paper, Francesco, you details more on the different metabolism or pathway, but it was in the case of dairy product, but it is, I think, generalizable at a certain level, because you always add as a nutrient in the substrate, you always have nutrients which are proteins, lipids, and polysaccharides, and so on. So the different kind of nutrient or chemical substrate are always the same, let's say, but then we have to know the conditions where these different components are metabolized, preferentially metabolized. So I agree, in brief.
Yeah, just to add, Matthew is right. The phylogeny, let's say, of the microorganisms often is not that indicative of what they're capable of. So it will be useful, at least in the fermentation, to I will not, as a microbiologist, I will not use the word classify, because it's more, for me, it's more the taxonomy is a classification. But I understand the concept that if you know what a microbe is capable of doing, and you can know it by doing whole genome analysis, you can predict how a fermentation with some detailed condition and substrates, you can at least in some ways predict this. This is something that in biology is used, and it's flux balance analysis basically, but it's not what we need here. We just need to understand that some microorganisms are capable of, for example, doing this step of the fermentation because they have these genes in their genome. That will be already a way detailed level of information. And it's very connected to the data world, because I can obtain data from the gene that are in a community. Nowadays, it's quite simple in a sense to obtain this. I can understand the composition of the community, but I'm less interested in it. I can see from the genes that are in a community, I can predict how the fermentation may go, knowing also the condition, for example, and which are the substrates to a certain level of, let's say, prediction.
Coming out of that, what's a little bit of a plan of action? Does this require a few other people to consult? And do we already know, like, for example, that there are these different kinds of basic enzymatic fermentation? Do we already have names for these basic types of fermentation? I think Magali mentioned we have a few. Is that already comprehensively named space?
I may ask to some researcher, but I think here in the audience we have different profiles. We have the dairy microbiology is already represented, and I think then beer and wine are a different fermentation, but they are alcoholic fermentation by yeast. So perhaps we have to enlarge the type of fermented product to have some different kind of fermentation, but I don't know what you think about.
We may engage some of the fermentation, at least of the, if you talk about the microbiological part, we may engage some of the society in nutritional or at least elementary microbiology. So microbiology of food that may be, for example, I myself had no much knowledge of the dairy domain, but some of the co-authors of our paper had this knowledge. When we finally get to understand which, well, the process of basically drafting the ontology. So we were talking about what's happening first, what's happening then, how we can model and etc. We really need to, the contribution of the people knowing the biological and also industrial process was very important, because some processes are really, really complex. For Parmigiano Reggiano, it's a really complex production because it's a lot of regulation and have a lot of steps in which the microbiology and the fermentation happen. So we need maybe expert of that production process, but not only in the way of, let's say, microbiology, but more also in the food technologist, I don't know, food technology and production process way.
I think in this case, we are already on the more detailed level rather than on the very generic. But it is the next step, yes, we have to involve some food processor and food processing aspects and other aspects also, but it is product dependent, I think, family product. I don't know, but yes, perhaps it will be later. I don't know if we do need to have so much detail at this moment. You know, are we able to find out what are the generic steps, or do we need some help to do so?
Can I ask, how much time do we have left right now for this group?
Well, 7 minutes. Maybe we're all starting to fade out anyway a little bit.
I wonder whether I would like to continue this conversation, of course. And we have an opportunity to do that next week at the Fermentation Hackathon.
Right.
So what we're talking about here about next steps, we could actually do next week. I think that would be, I would be delighted if we could do that. There will be a number of people at the conference who are, I mean, the conference is fermentation people. So it's an opportunity to get voices heard that may be actually important that we're not considering for some of this. Because I could be wrong, but I think Francesco is the only fermentation expert. I'm sorry, Chef Dan High is also a fermentation expert from a culinary perspective. So I think it might be useful to plan out what we might do at that. Is that okay if we spend the last few minutes talking about that? Like what steps people want to work on in the next time we're all together, and hopefully that's next time we're all together is next week. At least Robert and I will be there. I don't know if anybody else wants to participate.
I have no idea how it fits into my travel plans, but happy to have everybody think about next steps. And
I put a link to a sign up form if anybody's interested in signing up. I just made it. But I would love these voices to happen. It's the only virtual part of the conference, so it's quite flexible. But the idea is to have some sort of give and take with the fermentation folks throughout the conference.
Time?
It's on the form, so for people can select the times that they're best available, and we will work around what works for everyone here. And actually, I'd like to send this out to the broader Food On community for folks as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that this would be, this is an opportunity for this group to set the stage for what's going to happen there. And keep in mind that most of the people probably at that conference have never heard of the word ontology. So, but this is what we do, right? We bring these worlds together, the technology and the domains.
But workshop, it's open, or it's part of the whole fermentation let's say things?
So it's totally it's the only virtual part of the conference. So they weren't planning on having a virtual conference. I'll be honest. I was talking with Neil Vitali. So he has the slightly different spelling. He's the singular. You're the plural. He's the CEO of Fermentation Association, and we've been talking about doing some collaborations. We didn't know what it was going to look like, and then he's like, "Why don't you just come to Fermentation Association and bring ontology to the world of fermentation for us?" And I said, "Wow, that sounds like a great opportunity." And after a couple of discussions, it was like, "Why don't we have a hackathon?" And it's coming up right after this session that's happening now. And so we had some preliminary conversations with Damion, and now we're getting close. And so it's just about scheduling the folks essentially who are on this call, and perhaps a few others who weren't able to make this call to participate. So it's really whatever the agenda that this group wants to do, and hopefully there'll be an opportunity. We'll set up a side room or something if there are folks burning need. One of the things that I would like to do that we've talked about doing is setting up a repository, a Google Drive or something where people can drop what amount to, cool data sets about fermentations, about organism types, and we already have people who are coming who are suppliers of organisms who have massive web pages in wine and beer and for various types of fermentations. So that's actually pretty rich to be able to mine. They're publicly available web pages with organisms that you can choose to do a certain kind of fermentation in one way or another. But we can use those kinds of data sets to help us build a more generic ontology, I think. Something along those lines. I'd like to find a way to get the non-ontologists to be able to participate in this process, and I think that their input is valuable because they're domain experts.
Yeah.
You have anything to add, Robert, about that?
No, thank you. Thanks for bringing that up, Matthew. I'm on the advisory board for the Fermentation Association. For someone that's a non-ontologist, but trying to connect with this, I've realized that, yeah, I think it's a great point of having people that, one, have content, and two, have context, meaning how would it be useful for them to actually utilize, not just in research, valid, we have to start there, but how can we open the doors and open their minds to say, oh, I want to do a new type of fermentation within my facility. Let me see what's already been done, characterize results, parameters, equipment, in not in a book form, but in a process flow, because it's going to impact how they design their facilities, what suppliers they're going to need, and how they might market it in the marketplace that would be interested in it. Because if there's no, a sustainable business is one that makes money. And so if there's no audience for it, it's nice to have as a artist and craft, but if it is for business and industry, I think it's important to have this resource for them.
Just to add what Matthew was saying, as someone who was not that expert in fermentation, also not that expert in ontology and design as Damion, for example, I will say that the working with domain expert was not good, but was simply fundamental to do anything, because at the very end you can know everything about the complex process about like that one, and so you cannot know which are the thing that you need to model.
Right.
Okay. So we haven't really gone over the beer style because the upper level, let's say, took everything, but I had a look at the beer judge program, and I found out that there are really a lot of beer style which I was not I haven't any clue. I saw that in their page there is a nice Excel format for all these which is really ontologizable, let's say. I don't know if it is even exists as a word, but there is something really good already available in a freeable form, which is an Excel, because from PDF would have been a bit difficult.
Yeah.
So at least for beer, there is a lot of this information. I don't know if there is something similar also for other kind of fermented food. I mean, the collaborators that were in the dairy fermented modeling have done also some research on this for the dairy and built a database about this. So I at some point I could be able to get some information from them, but I don't know for the wine, for example, if we have something that can be translated into a thesaurus, a classification, an ontology in an easy way, let's say.
Okay, well, I think we have to wrap it up now.
Yeah.
So can we segue this into the conference discussion points?
I like the idea of classifying the types of fermentation outputs as an exercise. Classifying. I know you don't like to use the word classifying, but I'm using it in a generalized term, Francesco, not in a taxonomic term. But essentially, each of those things that you outlined, Damion, for the bimegaly.
Bye.
Each of the boxes that you outlined at the upper level there, Damion, we could begin to classify those as an exercise, and I think that those participants would be able to help us do those kinds of things. Maybe not at the pathway level, but there may be people there. I mean, there are microbiologists at this conference. So at the pathway level, that might be good too. Francesco, have you done any work specifically on sort of fermentation pathways, or is there a database on fermentation pathways?
Not really. Maybe if you go on that level, so on wine and fermentation, I would say that Duccio would be very more acknowledgeable than me.
Okay.
So I will try to re-involve a bit more. When we go down to the wine, I would say that you will catch its attention, because I will not. He like wines as much as every one of us, let's say. But I mean, from the fermentation and wine, it's a total expert. I mean,
Great. So we can, I mean, certainly, and maybe there's a session that we have that's devoted specifically to wine, or there's a specific dairy section or something. Well, I think we can do this from the bottom up as well as from the top down. And it needs to be sort of that iterative loop. We try doing this top down generalized structure. We get information from the bottom up that informs how we do the top down.
Sounds great.
but
Okay.
I also like the bottom up.
We got to wrap it. We got to cut it. We got to get out of this room. So, bye.
Thank you. It was, I would say it was really a stimulating and nice discussion. And thank you, everyone. And see you next time.
Okay.
Yep, sounds
Thank
good.
you.
Good.
Take care.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye-bye.